All right, and we are live back with another Future of Work Talk brought to you by Quorum One. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And also, of course, thank you, Hendrik, for joining us. I'll get to Hendrik in just a moment. The goal of these talks is to give us all a chance to dig into the works and thoughts of one of our members with a particular lens towards the future of work, the future of capitalism, the future of democracy, potentially, in general, the future of the types of systems that govern the way that we live and work. So, without further ado, I would love to introduce Hendrik Berberich. Hendrik is a lot of things. Hendrik is, I'm going to make sure I have this correct, because your bio is just lovely. But as I write, Hendrik is an advocate of the works of the art of hosting, collective leadership, constructive developmental framework, warm data, and complexity facilitation. Hendrik, thanks so much for joining us today. Please tell us about yourself, why you're here.
About myself and why I'm here.
Maybe that was too metaphysical of a way to start. Maybe I should be more specific. Yeah. How about we just start with yourself, then we'll start to get to the big question, right?
Yeah. So one part, I'm German by nationality. I live in Portugal, and been around the world quite a bit. 20 plus countries I've spent time in and had the pleasure to work with. Even more. I'm out of the very global international student association context. So I've been working in global volunteering context where nobody really gets paid, but everybody gets a lot of work done in very intercultural context. And that got me hooked already when I was 16 and got into intercultural communication and communication, which ultimately led to human development and personal development, which then led to complexity and systems theory and all that shebang, while having a business background in university studies with e-business, so a bit early on the tech part, and then sustainable city development. So sustainability has been a big piece. Today, I would say I'm an advocate of the regenerative movement to really go beyond sustainability and like zero carbons. Like actually, how do we create systems where flourishing can happen with all its stakeholders? And that means also that things die, and seeing the beauty in that. So there's a lot around life cycle thinking and these kind of pieces. And today I'd say I support individuals, organizations, and mainly networks, and like this future of inter-organizational space and how do you create the conditions, culturally speaking, decision making, how do we work together in more flourishing ways and intentional ways.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Fantastic. Let's talk about the complexity of living systems, right? We had a long conversation yesterday when we were doing our prep for this conversation, and you had a lot to say about, and correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, the sort of like hubris and arrogance of, and often the overlooking of just how complex living or organizational systems are.
Yeah, I think that's something we're slowly coming to realize from different angles, different schools of thought. Doesn't matter if you're like in business or in tech or if you're in biology or politics, like just the sheer volume of the challenges and the questions we're asking today, I feel in a sense overwhelming. The whole VUCA movement, the term coming in with velocity, uncertainty, complexity, anxiety. And I'm not sure what the A stands for right now. I need to actually let me look that up, because that is a beautiful term.
I'd say in general, it's safe to assume that the A, just writ large, stands for anxiety in these uncertain times.
I think it was likely
everyone in the audience
like
says, yeah, that checks out.
Ambiguity.
Okay.
Yeah, that comes the German through. Yeah, English is a
kinder version of anxiety. Ambiguity.
Yeah, exactly. All of this ultimately creates anxiety, right? That's why it's the last word. But so in complex questions, like depending which definition we'll look at, but the one I like a lot is that there is no right answer. So like I work, for example, with Dave Snowden's work, and I sometimes challenge his language. I know he sometimes uses provocative language, but one of the things he brought into the world is the Kneffin framework, and it's a framework, not a model. Like I'm talking about language. Part of my training is linguistics, so I'm very nerdy around terms, right? So frameworks help us like to look at the world, while a model tries to describe how the world works. So Kneffin really says this is not a model that doesn't describe how the world works, but it helps us to look at the world to make meaning of the world. And in Kneffin, there's a lot of complexity in it, but the simple version of it is distinguishing what system are we looking at. Is it a simple system? Is it a complicated system? Is it a complex system? Or is it a chaos? And each of them need a different approach how to address it. And I think that was a big thing. What his work contributed was this distinguishing, because right now a lot of us try to address everything as if it is a simple issue or simple system. It's like when we look at driving through traffic, right? At green I stop, at yellow I slow down, and at red I definitely stop, right? Like we don't argue with the design of that system. That's a simple answer to it. Like, I mean, then you can go more up and say, like, how do we design the entire infrastructure of the city? That I would go into a degree of complexity, but then there's part of some of these things are complicated. The typical example here is heart surgery. Like there is the best way so far we know. Like there's a good practice in this, which is the best way we know in the moment. It's a good practice, but we know that the practice can still evolve. While in simple systems, there's a best practice. The best practice with traffic light is to go with green, stop with red. Like if you don't do that, you might break the system, right? So and in complex systems, we don't know yet how, like we need to kind of sense, and then we need to probe, and then we analyze. While in simple, there's a clear action you can execute. In complex, you can analyze, and then there's a good practice you can apply, and then we review. While in chaos, you just need to act. You don't have the time to sense. Like hurricanes in the US are often typical examples of if complete destruction hits. You just need to start moving to get some kind of relationships back into place, to then move into complex, distinguish. There's some parts in this where it's simple, some where we need experts, and some where we need to kind of figure it out together. And that is, yeah.
Yeah, I think inclement weather is a fantastic example of this, because one, I have lived in a number of places that had regular inclement weather, tornadoes, hurricanes, snow, ice storms, all of that. And the hurricanes, you're absolutely correct. They do kind of manifest quite suddenly a lot of times, and the intensity is often ambiguous because there's no way to know just how strong or how weak a storm like that will be. But pretty much everyone that lives along the Gulf Coast of the United States understands always that, I mean, there's an entire hurricane season, right? And I think that goes to show that, and honestly, you'd probably say the same thing for San Francisco and earthquakes. Some people have earthquake insurance. If you live in the sort of greater areas of California, you most likely have fire insurance. And it just sort of shows that you don't live your life in any of these areas designing around the fact that a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake, but almost everyone has a plan, some type of plan, right, in order to mitigate that inevitable chaos of that incident taking place, right?
And it's an interest when you go into like the whole insurance world today. Is a super interesting deep dive. Also talking about data, their risk and analysis algorithms and how they're using. Like I think it's one of the most. The big insurances probably have the most accurate data, and there is. Recently someone shared this to me around longevity and human well-being, and there is someone like what we can know about genes now, that we pretty much mapped all the genes, and that you can identify a lot, and most of us don't really have the basic data about our bodies, and now we're not actually educated really to have the basic data about our bodies. But high level, like really the high level life insurances for the super rich, they can almost predict your death to the date. It's very crazy stuff.
Insurance actuarialism is probably one of the most ghoulish sciences out there. It is, you have to be a straight up glass-eyed psycho, more or less, to start designing around people basically like getting sick and not dying as a business value add. It's wild. Oh, it's cool. We don't have to fix this fatal manufacturing mistake on this car because the lawsuits will cost less, right? Like that kind of thing.
Exactly. Like that's the I can share that later in the links, or I will find the podcast episode with the guy. But they like, then they're not, the analysts are not allowed to talk to the people, even though they can predict based on having all the medical records. They can look into like certain patterns and know, okay, you actually should take care of your knees. And if you don't take care of the knees, you need a new knee, and that will cost you in 5 or 10 years. You will have to pay that, like, et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite an interesting space. But at the same time, there is an assumption in that space with the data that we're using, which goes into the simple and complicated frame. And there is a degree of usefulness. And this is where we then enter the complexity piece, because all I do is most of these data sets operate on past analysis. This is how this worked in the past. This is what we think we know, how human beings work, et cetera, and then deploy that on what we used to know. But when we talk about complex and living systems, you cannot dissect the interrelationships between them. Us having a conversation right now is highly influenced by us both having two screens. I'm in the evening of a long day, you're in the morning, right? Like these things inform how we are relating and what is possible to come out of this conversation.
Also that we're being recorded and we have an audience.
We're being recorded, also, which influences. Yeah. But then another school I come from where and when we really look at swarm data, you mentioned that as in the entrance, and that is transcontextual data. Because how we currently operate is the data we use, we take it out of context, out of this living moment, and then we analyze it. And we dissect nothing so we kill the moment to take a look at the moment. But that doesn't mean that this actually functions this way when it's in context and in relationship. And it's not like right now, like you can say something and then that triggers something with my history of my dad, or me being German is living in me and informs this moment, while I'm meeting you, like conditioned by a US American culture in parts. I don't want to speak for you, but like your national upbringing, your family history, all of these things inform it. Your father now, right? Like that came up yesterday, so that changes things. I don't have kids, but I have dogs, and having dogs barking while we have this conversation, that's like, right? It shifts what's possible to come out and navigating that. So if I acknowledge that is true, how do I work with the transcontextuality of this moment and where we are, and how do we allow the aliveness to exist as we are finding new possibilities forward, and only determining that based on past data that it isn't even true anymore ultimately when I look at the whole transcontextual complexity of life, because it already passed. And there's a usefulness in it. That's why I like Dave's distinction, like, okay, right, there is a usefulness for this. But deploying that way of thinking to all the decision-making we're doing is difficult. And this is important for me in particular because I work with human systems. And human systems are not mechanical, they're living. And then if that is a truth I come from, then I need to look at how we organize and make decisions radically differently. Yeah.
100%. And in fact, my next question, I do want to return to the idea of the transcontextual data. But I wanted to say, just for our audience, I was going to say, do you consider Quorum 1 a living system? And it sounds like the answer is yes.
So that's how I actually ended up here. So I worked for a consultancy where we did a long research on adult development theory and diving into these complex pieces and working with leaders and really understanding how do we transition into desirable futures. And on that path, I met some colleagues and looking and did where we work on an open, fair, and social internet, and that goes into sovereign data. And then if we have sovereign data, it's how do you link it around humans? But if you link it around humans, then the complexity of humans meeting humans just becomes crazy. And then one of the leverage points that we identified next to tech shifting is the financial piece. And then figuring out how do we actually fund in a way that allows these living human network organizations to exist and are not hijacked by current economic money patterns that take a lot of the multi-stakeholder, multi-capital perspectives out. Like that I'm fine to earn less because it serves the whole, that it serves nature, that it serves society, and I'm not just driven by financial profits. And a friend of mine posted that on LinkedIn, that I'm working on this with a colleague around creating a new form of a venture studio. And Hank from Quorum One then saw that post, and that's how we got talking. And it was mind-boggling for me, because when I looked at the pitch deck, I was like, this is almost exactly what we designed. This is not the only, like, I'm now come across, I think, 3 to 4 different projects that have similar approaches using different, like, theories coming from different teachers, but they all ultimately talk about the same patterns. A lot of about coming back to first principle, and then whichever, like, some studied the tribes of North America, some in Latin America, some went to Africa, and then it becomes the question: how do we take first principles and being aware to us being globally indigenous species? Like, I like to, like, we cannot go back to be tribal. It doesn't work. We are now in an internet global species. Like, what is the good term for consciousness? I don't know if I like the word consciousness per se there, but it's
well. There's that extant term, the collective unconscious. So maybe we should be less concerned about what's going on in the back of our minds and think about more of a collective consciousness or conscience. Even that would be nice. Everyone in the world had a conscience that didn't exclusively revolve around capital gains. Do you know who Will Smith is?
Like
the actor and the musician. Yeah. His son years ago tweeted basically my favorite tweet of all time, I think, which is he tweeted simply, "Why do I have to show you my passport? I was born on this planet." And that has lived rent-free in my head for easily over a decade. But what you were talking about in terms of the globally indigenous species, we're not tribal. These arbitrarily drawn and installed borders, just the fact that you can look at a map and there are right angles is something that we
And right, that's why I'm a big fan. Like right now, when I choose who to work with, it's either global networks that really experiment this new way of working with money and the way of working together and doing work together, and the rest is bioregions.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So coming out of the regen movement, their brilliant book by Samantha Powers and Dark Matter Labs just came out, the bioregional finance facilities. And some other colleagues from the Griffith Institute out of Australia, they just brought something cool out around intermediates, some cool blog posts. We can also put those in the show notes. I don't know who takes notes of this.
Did you say Suzanne or Susan Powers? Did I hear that correctly?
Samantha Powers.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, Samantha. So, but there's a bioregion. There are a lot of different research done, and we can put this, there's actually a global simulation that looks at the larger bioregions on the planet. And where you draw the line in a bioregion is the same question as where does the tree end and the soil begin, right? But we know that there are boundaries. And when I say boundaries like that comes from me out of what I teach when I work with humans and teams. But boundaries are not lines. Boundaries are territories where we meet and where we negotiate, where we move forward and back and forward. And the better we understand the boundaries expand and then we can move in here. And then in this moment, I'm actually a bit more here. I'm a bit more there. So there are boundaries in nature where certain fauna and weather patterns and things like shifting over, where you have more of this species and more of that, less of that, and where the biodiversity shifts. And you can define that quite well today, and even better with satellite imagery and like all of the tech that we have now. And so what we look at when we talk about, okay, what's the leverage point we have to actually create, when we talk about the boundaries of the planetary system that allows us to breathe air that is breathable, because that's also on the tipping point that we give that the chemical
composition of the atmosphere
of the air that we in general have shifts to us actually living in the Alps or Himalaya on high mountains. Like that, the composition shifts, and then we all like breathe heavy. Like that's something I like to take that, because a lot of people talk about water and flooding and like the rising of the oceans. Was like, this is just one of the many things that can flip over, and we're like in interesting space. So how do we address?
The night is dark and full of terrors, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If I had my climate depression, I know it's actually now recognized. Climate depression is now a recognized term in psychology. Recently, some students reached out to me to talk about climate emotions that young people experience by looking into future. That just like the emotions that they experience, and they did like a whole like research program on it. But coming back
climate
to
anxiety,
climate anxiety, like all the terms that show up. But so how do we address this? And then where can we pull together humans? And then because the global things is just total mess. So bioregional collaboration seems to be the thing that most people that have worked a long time in this space agree on, is the one where we can address problems with our municipalities and the cities and the human communities that live within specific bioregions. Like get most of your food from the bioregions, do social collaboration within bioregions, and then finance different agriculture, like all the different, there's a degree of best practices and good practices that we already have. Some people are working on mapping these different ways of addressing agriculture or industry. We have some people in the Forum 1 network that work with different chemical procedures of using waste so that certain raw materials don't have to travel all around the planet, that we actually can do that with microfactories in place. And how do you position them? So there's so many interventions and points of use, but like where do we draw kind of a governance innovation boundary to move this forward? Because if you don't set a boundary, then it's just everything and nothing. Like I've been enough in these experiments, let's save the world and let's bring everything together. And I talk about transcontextuality, and you need to think everything. And I think you need to do that. But we also need to meet the world where it's at. And so not everybody will dive deep into having a transcontextual, fully present perception and giving simpler answer. I think the bioregional narrative is also a very beautiful story that's easier to meet the world. And then it's about finding simple. Another thing I love, it's a phrase we use in my work and here at home a lot, is you need to explore the complexity of the system to arrive back at simplicity. And then I can say bioregions are a smart thing to do, which is a simple sentence. Finance, biology, ecology, politics, like you go through as much as you can, and then you come back to simplicity. But just be present. It's a simple statement. Have you done like a degree of work, sit with it, like to find a deeper meaning of the simple phrase?
So we're 100% agreed. And I think there is a lot of beauty in that framework and approach to things that humanity, people, individuals, companies, organizations often take for granted or kind of dismiss entirely as irrelevant. And it very much is relevant. But yeah, go ahead. And then since we're at the half hour, I want to take some questions from the audience. But please finish your thought.
And there comes in the idea of, when I look at organizational design, I'm highly influenced, dropping his name, acknowledging one of my heroes there, Graham Boyd's work around fair share commons. Carol Sanford is also big in this. But for me, we're talking about multi-stakeholderism and multi-capitalism. When we look at economic redesign and organizational redesign, it's a lot about bringing more people's voices and more perspectives in. And I think that is the typical problem-solving approach around thinking is usually reduce the problem to something simple and then take a step. But when you come with complexity, complex problems are never solved by reducing the problem. And that is a whole management theory that most CEOs and political leaders have been taught in, like, they embody the way of reduce it, address it. But on complex issues, you actually solve the problem usually by adding more context, by adding more information to create the space for new possibilities to emerge. And they usually come out of the complete different corner that you would have never imagined. So that is, and then when we look at organizational design, the whole idea about multi-stakeholder, like bring in the voices of the stakeholders that are affected by what you do. It doesn't need to give them all the power and all the equity and all of that. Whole different conversation we dive in there. And then the other one is multi-capitalism. Are you actually driving profit and try to do that on a more holistic layer? Are you tracking your social capital? Like B Corps went into this. In German, economy for the good is in Germany quite big. They actually have accounting models now to track financial, social, and environmental capital. B Corp does it, is quite big right now. And I think this is a good starting point. But it's also in some degrees overcomplicating a lot of things. And I am a firm believer if you actually give people governance rights and we make ourselves as an organization accountability to the stakeholders that we're affecting. And you actually, in the consultancy I worked in, when we had our general assembly, we had a chair, and that was nature. And we had a chair that was the organization. All of us are constellation people. So when we had conversations, then one of us could always get up and step into nature or step into the organization and kind of channel, if you want to search a term, or represent and try to speak through that perspective and bring that in. And this is a simple practice that already makes a lot of work. If you have your board meeting and you have a chair for nature and a chair for the community and a chair for the organization, and you allow that to be represented and just getting that way of thinking into your decision-making process, already doing a huge shift. Does the financial pressure at the end take over and you just ignore all of this? That is the navigation of this transition that we're in, or we need to learn how do we stay function as it is right now as we transition to something new. And now you have the process of bringing in people and questions. I see a lot of comments in the chat. So,
well, to comment on your last point, maybe that inevitable financial pressure wouldn't be as intense if some of the material conditions in the world were to, change somehow. Maybe if everyone wasn't constantly worried about the existential threat of starving to death, then we wouldn't be so stressed out in our boardrooms, right?
Yeah.
At least speaking from a Western perspective, for sure.
Yeah, but one of the things that really got me into deciding I'm just trying to make this happen now and building new and I'm not that much consulting big organizations to transition over, because for me, I decided I stepped more into building the examples of the new, which brought me to Quorum One. But working with a billionaire, he really wanting to make change, and then multiple organizations, and then the CEOs all being in there, like, I don't want to do this and do this. And then they had one organization where they actually wanted to get more equity and responsibility to the workers. And what happened was that the workers all went on strike because part of getting the responsibility and power came with flex pay. You cannot assume that if we get more ownership, you also get more responsibility, right? So, and the dependencies, like the paychecks in the country that we're in, on the paycheck was an entire family system dependent on that. So the insecurity of not receiving X amount of currency at the end of the month was putting so much pressure that it's like, I rather give up my power and whatever to get that security. And then realizing that the whole shift of organizations is super depending on the local economies and the reliability. Like, how is that? Like, what is the social political conditions enabling or not enabling? Yeah.
Whatever the social or socio-political conditions are, I can almost guarantee they were built on the backs of many laborers. But yeah, with that note, we have some questions about bioregionalism. So
Okay.
first of all, to go back to that part of our discussion, how does bioregionalism intersect with the other idea that you presented of global indigenousness? Like, how do those two concepts, like how do they work together or work in concert with each other?
So I think one phrase that is getting a lot of traction is like, think global, act local. And then so here's a thing that I think was obvious. We talked about it yesterday. Like, they're in Rebuild Our Economy, Leadership and You, Graham introduces this framework of strata. Strata are layers of the earth. It's a geographic term. And we look there, it's like the first strata is you as an individual, then comes interpersonal, which is what we're doing here right now. And then we have interpersonal, which is groups of people relating with groups of people. And then you have the organizational piece. And then you have an interorganizational, which is ultimately local economy. And then you have global economy. And then you have these 6 layers. I like to make them 8 because I like to put the universe on top and nothing in the center. But I'm also a yoga teacher, and I like to hang out in the spiritual practices. For the ones who don't like the spiritual, mythical lens, then go with the geographic ones or the system layer. So what we're looking at here is all of this shifts simultaneously. And then the question is, the higher strata create constraints or boundaries again for what's possible within them, right? If I operate in a hierarchical organization that is owned by one person, you will not do self-organizing because the insecurity of that, someone just overpowering your decision, because you don't allow the space for conflict, to really speaking truth, because there's always the insecurity you will fire me because you have all the power and the ownership, right? So as long as that ownership model is in place, you will not be able to do certain working models because it doesn't human dynamic wise operate. And then on top, so let's bring that to bioregions, because I love to talk. That's what I do when I do organization consultancy. So when we look at bioregions, it's the same thing. Where am I with my closest people? Systems like up to 15 people usually that you really can care about as a human being. So how are you doing with these? More than that, you cannot have in-depth relationship at the same time. Usually, there's a systems theory math to this. There's a human science math to this, and then you have who am I co-creating, working with, either in my social life or organizational life, and so on. So the economic constraints we're saying is, let's put economic constraints not about national boundaries, like borders, but let's put economic constraints, like the next layer, economically speaking, is on stratum 5 is the bioregion. And then on top, we have the global well-being. And then representatives of the bioregions are in conversation, they need to talk to the immediate neighbors because they are the boundaries that are not straight lines, but right? Like they're moving all the time and nature is evolving. And then on top, you have the global biosphere piece. But the global how do we trickle that down? If I take the global biosphere piece on 6, then I go into bioregional next. Then you have local economies, there's subsections of bioregions you can look at, which is your bioregions have subsections as well. And then you kind of get into the tricky place. We highly influenced nature already with what's there, right? Do we need to start looking at municipalities and in that layer? Because municipalities are nothing else than an organization. That's purpose of organizing, and one of its purposes is to take care of how we live together. And then there are a lot of institutions that were organized on that level to facilitate that. And then comes your household, and then comes you So this is how I would look at this, weaving it together. We're talking about a different systemic level that also needs different approaches than the ones rippling down. And they're not happening in isolation. They're all happening at the same time. And there needs to be interventions on all of them at the same time. It's happening anyway, but we can make that consciously with intentionality. And that is the main invitation I'm speaking to in my work, is like, let's bring more conscious intention into this. And where are we? And a lot of discussions in the decentralized world is mixing these things, bringing practices from how we relate with each other into organizational pieces like that. That's not, you're meeting a whole different level of complexity of law and economic constraints in the world right now. That is, you cannot just, there's certain, we can learn from a lot of principles that I can apply to myself, and we can apply at an organizational level or even bioregional organizing, but it's different because we're operating in a different context. The context is bigger, right? I wouldn't say the complexity is different, but there's a different complexity we're talking about, right? Because we both are very complex beings. Human systems are very complex beings as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
On that subject, especially when we think about the complexity of what happens across nation state lines, right?
Yep.
And how often it ignores bioregionalism or literally anything else existing outside of those imaginary lines that someone, let's be honest, probably a European drew however many hundreds of years ago, right? Like regardless of where you are in the world.
Talking about heritage.
Yeah. Heritage. #heritage, not parody. I am not serious about that.
I'm not responsible for my ancestors.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
talk about climate anxiety. I certainly have. I have ancestral trauma. Anxiety. Yeah.
Guilt, and ancestor guilt, and sitting with that. Yeah.
It's funny that there's two types of generational trauma. There's the things that you inherit from your parents or your caregivers or the sort of adults and authority figures in your young life, where you're sort of inheriting their anxieties and neuroses. And then there's the generational trauma of all the terrible things your ancestors did that they don't really care that they did. But they probably have no guilt to pass down because they thought they were perfectly justified in their actions.
Exactly. Right? They didn't know what they were doing. Like, the only thing was like, everything we're going to do is going to have unintended consequences. So the best we can do is try to kind of figure out how we navigate that. And that is, for me, why I want to operate with. Dave has some meaning-making tools that I work with the sense maker that allows the narratives and individual interpretations of people in a system to be visualized and worked with. Like it's sort of thick data, because it's qualitative data, but it is quantified. And then we can work with that kind of data, which is, at least it acknowledges that you and I have different interpretations, and we both live in different worlds of interpretations, but we are working together in Quorum One. Like one of the suggestions, actually, I'm starting to bring this into this DAO new workspace, because I think this is the way we can actually operate with cultures and make direction visible. Because that's why we talked about it yesterday. We haven't brought it up here. I'm not a big fan of purpose and vision and like where we're going and goal setting. Anything beyond 3 months is a bit arbitrary. Like I can have an intentionality and I can say this is the direction we're going right now, but I'm not really attached to it. And then we work, and then things happen, and unintended consequences take place. And then I see again where we are now and whether to take the next step. And I can live my life like this, and which makes me way calmer these days with the complexity and the craziness in the world, because I'm not attached to any future direction. It's like I will figure it out. One of my mantras in life. I will figure it out. We will figure it out.
Yeah, we will figure it out. This is a terrible pun, but that's very Taoist of you.
Yeah, I mean, there is a wisdom in a lot of these old traditions. So no wonder Buddhism is getting so much traction, or Taoism is getting so much traction, because the teachings come back a lot to simple first principles and being in the moment, being present, and not having this hubris idea that I know how the world works. All I share right now is the best I know in this moment. If we have this conversation in a week and I come across, have a new experience, I learn something new, I might give you completely different answers to the best of my, but what I choose to believe in this moment is bioregionalism makes sense, and the new venture studio finance design makes sense for large global working networks, best focused on sectors. And the other one is let's figure this out with bioregions. And I'm dedicating my world to that. And that means I need to work with the arbitrary lines of boundaries and municipalities and all of that. But I don't need to completely comply to that in this design of what I'm building. And I think that's the same thing that we're looking at. And that's why we have good lawyers who help us to operate in the gray and not break any laws that get us in prison to the most part. And then we have the rebels. I just saw yesterday Greta Thunberg was arrested in Stockholm, right? Like for saying this is not good. But there's more, like we have 11 minutes and there are more questions. Maybe I get off on rants because I'm super excited, as you notice. And to the people, like if you get me in a rant of these topics, I'm learning to be more precise. It's one of my learning edges.
No, this is we here at Quorum One appreciate and support the right of any individual to go on rants. It's fantastic.
Sometimes good to rant.
Indeed, if you or anyone listening wants to hear some really impassioned rants, please go check out the Future of Work Talk with Saskia Barris, because I did near the end say, Saskia, pissing you off right now, and she had an entire arsenal of things to it was wonderful. It was fantastic. I loved interviewing Saskia. So I'm not sure if there are more questions. We certainly discussed that, but I actually wanted to talk about one more thing before we wrap up here, and it's something I didn't ask you about yesterday. Heard you mention and I put a bunch of exclamation points next to it. And it's possible this isn't as big of a deal as I'm making it, but yesterday when we were talking about transcontextualism and data, you repeatedly used a phrase, narrative data. And as a storyteller, I absolutely love incorporating any kind of narrative context to data. But I'd love to hear more. So I guess please tell us, what is narrative data?
So that is the work with SenseMaker. So the idea is that if I collect so we call it micro narratives, because it should just be a short story, and then in the SenseMaker we're exploring a specific context. Let's take this example. How would this work in Quorum One? So we say we want to make visible the culture we're in right. So what we would do is we set up a SenseMaker, and then every member can, as many stories as you want, you create, but you share little micro stories, which is this micro narratives of your experience in working in Quorum One. And then you self-assess that on certain parameters, which are partly binary, but the ones I like more are the triangles, so that we're not getting into either or, but we actually get into triangles. My favorite example to share, like there's a really cool one we're doing right now with one of the European parties to do citizen engagements, and like how do we create more citizen engagement with citizens in Europe, and correcting thousands of micro-narratives from citizens. But then you get but people share their own story, and they self-assess their stories on these parameters, which go through with a team before you really sit with like, what is really what we want to make visible or not visible? And that is self-critical as well. But then you have these culture heat maps. You have all these stories, but you also have these heat maps. And then you can say, okay, where are the outliers here? And what stories are they telling? It's super interesting. And the outliers tend to be the more interesting ones. But I also can put these on different axes to say, okay, this is where we are, and where's the data positioned. And you can make this, but it's data based on small narratives of people and the self-interpretation of it. And I think that's a very important piece here, that we're not having experts look at the stories and then assess it. I've been in a space where we've done that. I actually now choose to believe that's not the smartest way. I think there can be a benefit in it. Like all the personality assessments and strength finders and all of that that's out there. There's a beauty in that to give you a nudge into self-reflection. It can kind of give you language and distinctions. And I think that for that it's useful. But if we look at complex cultural data, this is how that works. And then from that, we identify, okay, this is where we are. So which direction now do we want to go? What stories do we want more of? And which stories do we want less of? Like, what do we want a little bit more of and what a little bit less of? That's kind of, you don't say, based on this, what data would we like to change a bit in this direction? Which data do we want to change in that direction by having less or more of it? And from this, we identify micro experiments to do small experiments to see what works and what's not. And you can do entire self-reflection analysis, by the way, and there's also an important distinction here. You do journaling always while you do the experiment, not afterwards. By the way, that's completely contradicting what Scrum does, because there is a bunch of cognitive biases that kick in when we look back at what we did and then assess it based on success or failure, our personal experience and the emotional state we're in that moment, versus actually having collected stories and perceptions while we were doing it, which gets us way more momentarily data. And this is like different, like it's a different way of using that framework as well. You can use SenseMake also to apply it. Like I haven't even thought about it. It's just coming up right now. It'd be super cool to apply that on a Scrum or Agile network to do retros completely differently, more based on the interpretations of the team members while they were working, to then see what we need to, because there's looking back and reflect. Again, the cognitive bias is kicking in, and then we're screwing it. Yeah. So that is a bit
And
like these are two different things of how to work with that data.
You're not existing in the moment because you're looking back at what's already been done.
Exactly. And then when you know how memory works, it's very scary. Don't trust your memories.
Hendrik, we don't have another 9 hours to discuss our thoughts on memory, unfortunately. Yes, actually, weirdly enough, though, I will say I did briefly study memory theory in college, and it was very much the Nietzschean staring into the abyss. I was like, I can't keep studying this. This is terrifying. This research is very much looking back into my soul. Oh, you have to.
Like looking at life, like the whole, I don't know if you like, for another thing, metamodernism is a very cool movement as well. I'm hanging out with these guys sometimes, and like they intentionally wrote, there's this book, The Listening Society, and the author is Hansi Freiner, which is not a person. It's a fictional character the two authors created to give themselves permission to be more satirical and humorous. And the way it's written is very like addressing the challenging the reader all the time. It's like, if you're running away now, then. So it's like we need a bit of the humor and playfulness with like, and not take it too serious. Yeah.
Yeah. Versus I like how self-aware that example is compared to some of the postmodernist stuff that is just full of its own smugness. Great books, but if you look at that in comparison to, say, Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, eventually you get through most of that book and you're like, okay, Italo, okay, we get it. You're very smart. You're very smart. This is very creative. I'm honestly no aspersions to Italo Calvino. I don't even think that's the writer's real name because that's how postmodernism works. Nothing is real. Everything's silly. But it is a fantastic book. But I would love to, I don't know if there's an English translation of that book, but I might have to put that on my reading list.
I mean, The Listening Society is an English book first. And it comes out of the whole Sweden movement, the inner development goals. I've been was in that bubble for a while too. Yeah, what I like the people who say they understand metamodernism haven't understood metamodernism, because the definition of metamodernism is it's the emerging paradigm. Meaning
it's really Dada 2.0.
We don't know yet what it is. We just know it's happening, and that I agree with. That frame of reference in that was for me. Yes, a lot of things are like moving. It's like for me, I'm with this one ventures project, and then Forum 1 comes around, and I look at the pitch deck. I was like, did you copy paste our pitch deck? What's happening? You're like, what's going on, right? So There's something.
We're mind
There's something
thieves.
here.
No, it turns out we are victims. I say that satirically. We are victims of what appears to be a global convergence of a lot of very intelligent and very capable and very experienced professionals coming to the same conclusion, which is that this system that we operate under, and you can basically, whatever comes to your mind, listeners, as I say, this system, whatever that is, it's fucked. It's broken. And the most common response that I hear to that statement, the system is broken, are examples of how the system is working. And I immediately respond, and just for whom is it working? Is it working for you? Unless you're a billionaire, probably not, right? Unless you're, unless you live in a place that is not going to be affected very much by climate change, you have the resources, the wherewithal to mitigate the things that are extremely impactful and drastic and dangerous, potentially fatal to others around the world, right? Like it's not working. It's working for 0.5% of the population of the world.
On the big picture, right? I think a lot of people come in there and like there's a sense of hope and like not take everything I believe, like right, like it's a defense mechanism that also comes out and like having empathy with that. And I agree with both statements. And that's the beauty of the human mind, right? We can have both two
things can be more than
paradoxes.
one thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
things can
because
be
there
more than
are
one
things
thing,
that are working. Let's do more of what's working and let's do less of what's not working. And that is the whole thing. I'm like, it's not one or the other. It's finding.
Correct. It's not a binary.
Let's experiment our way forward.
Yes,
Okay?
for sure. I will say, if I can be critical one more time, that the things that are working are more often than not sponsored by, sort of the main detractors of the system, right? But yeah, there are wonderful things that individuals, collectives, I would say even, I'm sure there are good companies out there somewhere, that they're doing that are for the benefit, right? That are for the positive. And I think, and I'm so happy for you to have joined Forum One, and of course for you to join us today, because I think the things that yourself, some of our other guests like Saskia, are working on are really going to, help us untether, all these kind of things that we've just resigned ourselves to believing are just forever, are concrete. And when it turns out they're not, everything is far more fluid, adjustable, malleable. And it's up to us to be resilient, adaptive in order to get there, get to that greater good, right?
Agreed. Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah, no, that wasn't necessarily a sign off.
I was looking forward to this. This was fun. The nerd in me always gets really excited about these conversations.
I would say that the nerd in me, but honestly, at this point, I'm 99% nerd. There's no in or out. I'm just a nerd. I have a Star Wars tattoo. Like, I think that's all I had to do to really get to that nerd achievement badge. Let me just double check, make sure there are any more questions. Nope. But yeah, so at the close of this, we've discussed so many different authors and books and so on and so forth, and those will all be included in the show notes when this is published on wherever you can find podcasts and the Quorum One YouTube channel. Check us out. Smash that subscribe button. Just kidding. That's awful. Don't do that. Subscribe. Just ignore the fact that I said smash that subscribe button. What would you like to plug?
I'd love to plug. I have a couple links. I don't know if we put them in the chat. So one thing is just type my name into your browser window and .com, and then you find my website, which I recently updated. There are most references in there. The two I'd love to name beyond that is Complexity Partners. These are the guys I work with from out of Berlin, and these are my direct link to Dave and the work we do there. Then Popcorn for Life, which is the company I run here with my best friend out of Portugal, where we create living cool experience design retreats. So we have a New Year's retreat coming up, for example, and then otherwise connect on LinkedIn and Instagram. And if you're in the larger bioregion around Lisbon, this is really like the larger Lisbon municipality area is really where I'm dedicating more of my time now to set up these intermediate organizations for bioregional regeneration. And looking forward to more at Forum One.
So are we. And so on behalf of Quorum One, which you yourself now comprise a portion of, thank you for joining us once again today. For the rest of you still listening, and if you're listening this in a recorded fashion, again, please check us out on social media. You can find us on LinkedIn at Quorum One. Find us on the social media website formerly known as Twitter, also Quorum One, and then of course also on YouTube. And we'll be hopefully publishing a bunch of clips of this very conversation. And if you were already a member of Quorum One, it sounds like feel free to reach out to Hendrik directly in our Slack instance if you have any other questions. And if you're not in Quorum One, please visit https://quorum.one/join. And it's as easy as that. You can too be part of this wonderful growing collective. Also, I will apologize on behalf of Hendrik. Earlier, Hendrik said it was only possible to have an intimate or meaningful relationship with no more than 15 people. Have everyone listening, I want you to know he did not have my permission to speak on my behalf, and I love all of you. And with that,
that's something different, my friend. You can love everyone.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, you're right. I will concede that I incorrectly and disproportionately just associated a relationship and love, even though those two things are mutually exclusive. I don't know how much that says about me, but there you go. Just wearing my heart on my sleeve, I guess. Anyway, with that note, happy Thursday, everyone, and thanks again.
Happy Thursday. And thanks for tuning in.